Do you really know who's by your side, or do you just believe you do? Because there's a huge difference between what a person shows, and who they truly are when no one is watching. And the uncomfortable truth is that, most of the time, character isn't revealed through beautiful speeches, promises, or carefully planned moments. It reveals itself in quiet, almost invisible moments, when there's no control, no audience, and no reason to appear better than you really are. And maybe you've already experienced this without even realizing it. That strange feeling of, how did I not see this before? As if, all at once, a mask had fallen away, revealing someone completely different from the person you thought you knew. But the deeper question isn't about them, it's about you. What within you caused certain signs to be overlooked, even though they had been there all along? Carl Jung once said something incredibly profound about this: no one becomes conscious of themselves without first confronting their own shadow. And in this context, the shadow isn't something mystical, it's everything a person tries to hide, deny, or control within themselves. What's even more unsettling is that the shadow doesn't disappear simply because it's hidden. It reveals itself. It leaks out. It shows up in subtle gestures, automatic reactions, and repetitive patterns of behavior that people often don't even realize they're displaying. That's why understanding someone's true character has nothing to do with trusting their words. Words can be crafted. Speeches can be rehearsed. Images can be carefully constructed. But the unconscious always leaks through. And once you begin to understand that, you realize that character was never completely hidden. It has always been revealing itself through small actions, especially in moments when a person isn't trying to be watched. The problem is that most people have been taught to pay attention to what is said, not to what is done inconsistently. But depth psychology teaches the exact opposite. It's in emotional inconsistencies, impulsive reactions, moments of frustration, and discomfort that a person's true pattern begins to emerge. Because no one can maintain a mask once they lose emotional control. And maybe that's why some relationships become so confusing. At first, everything makes sense. The person seems consistent, interesting, even trustworthy. But over time, small details begin to surface. Reactions that don't match. Behaviors that feel out of place. Silences that say more than words ever could. And even then, you often choose not to pay attention to those signs, not because they aren't there, but because accepting them would completely change the image you've built in your mind. And this is exactly where the most important part of this conversation begins, because understanding someone's character isn't just about observing them. It's about learning to see what the mind usually overlooks, even though it has always been there, hidden within the most fundamental patterns of human behavior. And once you begin to see that clearly, something changes in the way you relate to people, and, most importantly, in the way you make sense of things that once seemed far too confusing to explain. And if, by this point, this idea has already made you think of someone specific, or of a situation where something simply didn't add up, then that's not a coincidence. This kind of reflection only works when you actively take part in it, because it's through recognizing your own experiences that you begin to notice patterns you once overlooked. So before we continue, take a moment to like this video. It's more than just a simple click. It helps this message reach other people who also need to understand the signs they often overlook in everyday life, especially when it comes to human behavior and character. And I'd like to invite you to go one step further. Leave a comment below if you've ever experienced something like this, a situation where someone seemed to be one way, only to reveal something completely different later. Or maybe a moment when you realized the truth far too late. Reading those stories doesn't just bring clarity to you, it helps others who may be going through the very same emotional confusion. And if this kind of content resonates with you, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Because here, the goal isn't just to talk about human behavior on the surface, it's to dive into the deeper psychological patterns that shape our decisions, our relationships, and even the way we interpret the people around us. Now, with that in mind, let's begin to understand what truly reveals a person's character once all the masks start to fall away, and why it almost never happens the way most people expect. A person's true character rarely reveals itself when everything is under control, it emerges precisely when control is lost. Think about that for a moment. You can know someone for months, even years, and still have never seen them under real pressure, real frustration, real loss, real rejection, or in a moment when life doesn't go the way they wanted. And it's precisely in those moments that human psychology shifts to an entirely different level, because we're no longer dealing with what the person wants to show, we're dealing with what they can no longer hide. And here's something most people completely overlook: no one maintains the same personality all the time. Carl Jung called this the persona, the social mask we wear to adapt to the world. It's the version of ourselves that is acceptable, likable, and functional. But the persona is not our true character. It's simply a social construction, a psychological role. The problem is that many people mistake the persona for identity. They believe that the way someone behaves in neutral situations is enough to define who they truly are. But real character doesn't reveal itself in neutrality. It reveals itself in moments of rupture. In emotional breakdowns. In the instant something touches an inner wound that the person has never truly resolved. And that's where the shadow appears. Jung described the shadow as everything that has been repressed: impulses, insecurities, aggression, wounded pride, the need for control, fear of abandonment, the desire for power. None of it disappears simply because it's ignored. Quite the opposite. The harder someone tries to appear balanced all the time, the more intensely that shadow may emerge once it slips through. And this is important to understand: no one is made of light alone. Even the kindest, most rational, most compassionate people carry reactions within them that don't appear under normal circumstances. And that's exactly why understanding someone's character requires time, context, and above all, careful attention to what happens when the situation is no longer comfortable. Have you ever noticed how some people completely change the moment they're challenged? It's not a subtle shift. It's as if something deep inside suddenly takes over. Their tone of voice changes. Their eyes change. Their energy changes. And for a few brief seconds, you catch a glimpse of someone who didn't seem to exist before. That's the moment the persona fails, and the shadow steps into view. And this isn't the exception, it's the rule. Character isn't revealed in calm. It's revealed through friction. When someone loses something they wanted, feels ignored, doesn't receive the validation they expected, is no longer the center of attention, or is forced to deal with boundaries they never anticipated. Those are the moments when behavior stops being strategic and becomes instinctive. And instinct never lies. Because it isn't filtered by social image. And perhaps this is one of the most uncomfortable parts of this realization: you don't discover who someone truly is by asking questions, watching performances, or listening to polished speeches. You discover it by observing repeated patterns in situations where that person has no emotional advantage. And that completely changes the way you see relationships. Because suddenly you realize that many interactions that seem perfectly clear haven't actually revealed anything meaningful yet. They're still happening within the safe territory of the persona. They haven't reached the place where the shadow begins to emerge naturally, almost involuntarily. And once you begin to understand this, something strange happens: you start noticing little details that once seemed insignificant. An exaggerated reaction here. A cold silence there. A different behavior when things don't go as planned. Small fragments that, on their own, don't seem to mean much, but together begin to form a psychological pattern far clearer than any carefully crafted speech ever could. And this is where your understanding reaches another level, because you realize that character isn't a fixed definition, it's a collection of repeated responses under emotional pressure. And the more you observe this, the more you begin to notice that some people remain consistent even in chaos, while others fall apart the moment reality refuses to match their expectations. And that raises an even deeper question, because if a person's true character reveals itself in these moments of rupture, then the question isn't just how to recognize it in others, but why. Even after seeing these signs, the human mind so often insists on interpreting them differently, as if something within us resists seeing what has already become obvious. And that's exactly where this analysis begins to move into an even deeper, and more unsettling, psychological territory. But this is where everything starts to become even more uncomfortable. Because even after understanding that character reveals itself through rupture, friction, and the loss of emotional control, there's still something within us that insists on ignoring it. As if the mind creates a kind of internal resistance, a quiet tendency to justify the unjustifiable, soften what was obvious, or reinterpret clear warning signs as nothing more than misunderstandings. And this doesn't happen simply because of naivety, it happens because of psychology. Carl Jung believed that human beings are driven not only by reason, but also by unconscious forces far deeper than they realize. And one of those forces is the need to maintain emotional consistency with what we already believe. In other words, once we create an image of someone in our minds, the psyche naturally tries to protect that image, even when reality begins to contradict it. That means that, many times, you're not just observing someone's character, you're also protecting the idea you've built about them. And that changes the entire dynamic. Because now it's no longer just about the other person. It's about the internal conflict between what you see and what you want to believe. And this is one of the most subtle aspects of human psychology. The mind doesn't always seek the truth, it seeks stability. And when the truth collides with an emotional expectation, it creates discomfort. So the brain tries to reduce that discomfort by reinterpreting the signs, rationalizing behavior, or postponing conclusions. That's why so many people take so long to recognize someone's true character, even when the signs have been there all along. Not because they lack intelligence, but because they have an emotional investment. And the greater the emotional investment, the more sophisticated the denial becomes. Jung would call this projection, when you don't see another person only as they truly are, but also as a mirror of your own expectations, desires, and inner needs. You project meaning onto that person. And as long as that projection remains active, you don't see the real individual, you see an emotionally filtered interpretation of them. And that explains why two people can witness the exact same situation and walk away with completely different conclusions. One clearly sees a pattern of inconsistent behavior. The other sees just a bad day. One notices repetition. The other sees an exception. And what's most fascinating is that neither of them is entirely wrong, but only one is seeing the full pattern. The problem is that patterns don't reveal themselves in isolated moments. They emerge through repetition over time, especially as circumstances change and a person can no longer maintain the same version of themselves across different situations. And this is where one of the strongest indicators of character comes into play: consistency under changing emotional conditions. Because anyone can appear emotionally balanced when everything is going well. Anyone can seem kind when they're being appreciated. Anyone can appear rational when they're not being challenged. But true character reveals itself when those conditions disappear. When there's loss. When there's conflict. When there's frustration. When there's rejection. And it's precisely in those moments that the persona begins to crack, and the shadow starts to emerge beyond conscious control. What's most unsettling is that, in those moments, the person isn't playing a role. They're simply reacting from deep layers of the psyche that are no longer filtered by their social image. And that means character isn't something a person consciously chooses to reveal, it's something that inevitably comes to the surface when the mind's internal mechanisms of control begin to break down. But even then, something even deeper is happening. Because even when the signs are obvious, even when the inconsistencies become impossible to ignore, there's still a deeply human tendency to minimize what's right in front of us. As if there were a kind of emotional resistance to accepting that someone doesn't match the image we've built of them. And this isn't just about romantic relationships. It happens in friendships, in families, at work, in any situation where there's an emotional bond. And the stronger the bond, the harder it becomes to see the truth clearly. Because now it's no longer just an outside observation. It's an internal threat to the story that has been holding that relationship together. So the brain, in its effort to preserve emotional stability, begins to reorganize the evidence. It starts reinterpreting behavior. It starts justifying patterns. It starts postponing conclusions. And little by little, your perception of reality is reshaped to fit what feels emotionally tolerable. That's why, so often, someone's true character isn't discovered all at once, it's uncovered layer by layer, almost as if reality slowly reveals itself as the illusion gradually loses its grip. But there's something even deeper beneath all of this, because if the human mind still hesitates to acknowledge what's obvious even in the face of repeated patterns, then the question is no longer just about the other person's behavior, it's about what within us needs to believe in that particular version of reality, even as it slowly falls apart before our eyes. And once you begin to observe all of this more closely, an even deeper realization begins to emerge, one that's almost unsettling in its simplicity. Because it's not just about seeing someone's character clearly. It's about recognizing just how skilled the human mind is at avoiding that clarity. There comes a point where you're no longer dealing only with outward behavior. You're dealing with psychological interpretation. And this is where Carl Jung offers one of the most important ideas for understanding this phenomenon: whatever is not integrated into consciousness doesn't disappear, it continues to influence, quietly and invisibly, the way we perceive reality. That means that, many times, you're not seeing people as they truly are, you're seeing them through the lens of your own emotional framework. And that changes everything. Because now the issue isn't only the other person's behavior. It's also the filter through which you interpret that behavior. Jung called this projection. And projection isn't simply imagining things or fooling yourself. It's a far more sophisticated psychological mechanism. It's when parts of yourself, your desires, expectations, fears, emotional wounds, and need for validation, are unconsciously projected onto another person. From that moment on, they stop being just who they are, and also become what they represent to you. And that creates an incredibly powerful psychological effect. You no longer respond only to the person's actual behavior, you also respond to the emotional meaning you've attached to them. That's why two people can go through the exact same situation and have completely opposite reactions. For one person, certain behaviors are already clear signs of inconsistency, instability, or poor character. For the other, those very same behaviors are dismissed as just a phase, the circumstances, a strong personality, or even something they'll grow out of with time. The facts haven't changed. The behavior hasn't changed. But the interpretation has changed completely. And that's because the mind doesn't seek accuracy alone, it seeks emotional consistency. And there's something even deeper happening here. Because when you create an internal image of someone, especially someone with whom you share an emotional bond, that image begins to take on a psychological life of its own. And any information that contradicts it creates internal discomfort. So what does the brain do with discomfort? It tries to reduce it. And there are only two ways to do that: either you change the image you have of the person, or you change the way you interpret the signs. And in most cases, the brain chooses the second option, because it hurts less. That means that, very often, reality isn't adjusting itself to your perception is adjusting itself to your emotional need to preserve a stable narrative. And that creates a subtle, almost invisible distortion. You're not consciously ignoring the signs. You're automatically reinterpreting them. And that's the most important point: psychological self-deception is rarely conscious. It's a gradual process, built through countless small internal compromises. It wasn't really that bad. Everyone makes mistakes. Maybe I'm overreacting. Deep down, they're still a good person. Each of those thoughts, taken on its own, sounds perfectly reasonable. But together, they build an alternative version of reality. A version that's emotionally comfortable. And this is where Jung's depth psychology becomes even more relevant, because he argued that the unconscious doesn't merely influence our emotions, it also shapes the way we perceive reality through symbols. In other words, what you don't want to see clearly doesn't disappear, it simply changes form within your interpretation. That's why a person's true character is rarely something you suddenly discover. It's something that gradually reveals itself as your projections begin to lose their hold. As the idealization begins to fade. As emotional reality starts to outweigh the story you've been telling yourself. And it doesn't happen all at once. It happens in layers. First come the small inconsistencies you try to explain away. Then come the patterns you try to normalize. Then come the repetitions you try to ignore. Until you reach a point where the person's behavior can no longer fit into the narrative you've created. And that's the moment the mask doesn't actually fall, it simply stops working. But even then, there's something even deeper behind this entire process. Because if the human mind is capable of distorting signs, reinterpreting patterns, and protecting emotional narratives even in the face of repeated evidence, then the real question is no longer just how to recognize someone's character. But what within us needs to keep certain illusions alive, even when part of us already knows, quietly, that they can no longer be sustained. And that's exactly where this understanding reaches yet another level. And it's precisely when you begin letting go of those illusions that the greatest transformation takes place. Not because the people around you suddenly change, but because the way you see them is no longer driven by expectation, it is guided by awareness. And that difference may seem subtle, but it completely changes the way you recognize someone's true character. Carl Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." That idea goes far beyond self-awareness. It also explains why so many people repeat the same kinds of relationships, surround themselves with the same behavioral patterns, and keep being disappointed by remarkably similar personalities, even while believing they're meeting completely different people. In reality, what often repeats itself isn't the type of person, it's the way the mind chooses to see them. When you don't understand your own emotional patterns, you end up relying on superficial criteria to judge someone's character. You see kindness and assume goodness. You notice intelligence and mistake it for wisdom. You see confidence and conclude that someone is emotionally balanced. But none of those qualities, by themselves, tell you much about who a person truly is. Someone can be exceptionally polite and, at the same time, deeply manipulative. They can speak calmly while treating others with cruelty when no one is watching. They can appear generous in public while showing contempt toward those who have nothing to offer them. Character can never be measured by the appearance of a single virtue. It can only be recognized through the consistency between what a person does, especially when there is no reward, recognition, or personal advantage to gain. And that's where one of the most reliable principles of practical psychology begins to emerge. Watch how someone treats people who have absolutely nothing to offer them. Watch how they behave when no one is admiring them. Listen to how they speak about someone who isn't there to defend themselves. Notice how they handle mistakes they didn't make but are still expected to take responsibility for. Those moments reveal far more than any declaration of values or principles ever could. There's a psychological reason for this. Character isn't a collection of beautiful statements. Character is a habit. It's an inner structure that remains relatively stable even as circumstances change. Emotions fluctuate. Moods shift. Environments change. But certain patterns keep showing up. And it's that repetition that deserves your attention. Many people spend their time trying to figure out whether someone is lying in a specific conversation, analyzing facial expressions, tone of voice, or body language. While those details can certainly provide clues, they rarely tell the whole story. The real secret isn't found in analyzing a single moment. It's found in quietly observing repeated behaviors over time. Because one action may be accidental. Two may be a coincidence. But when the same pattern keeps appearing across different situations, you're no longer looking at chance. You're looking at a character trait. Developing this kind of perception requires patience, because the mind craves quick answers. It prefers to label someone as good or bad right away because that saves mental energy. But analytical psychology teaches the opposite. understanding a human being requires time, observation, and a willingness to embrace complexity. Perhaps that's why Jung placed such importance on the process of individuation. The more aware you become of your own inner mechanisms, the less dependent you are on first impressions, and the more capable you become of seeing what's truly happening. Interestingly, once you begin to develop this way of seeing, you stop being impressed by polished speeches and start paying attention to details that once seemed insignificant. You notice how someone reacts when they're corrected, how they deal with envy, guilt, frustration, and other people's success. You notice whether their kindness remains when no one is praising them, whether their respect endures when the other person is no longer useful to them. And little by little, you realize that character never advertises itself. It simply reveals itself, quietly, through the repetition of everyday choices. And perhaps this is the moment when the most transformative question of this entire reflection finally emerges. Because once you've learned to see other people's character with greater clarity, it becomes impossible not to turn that same gaze inward. After all, if character is revealed by the patterns we repeat when no one is watching, then what have your own patterns been revealing about who you truly are, beyond the image you try to present to the world? If this reflection stirred something within you, leave this phrase in the comments: character reveals itself through patterns. That simple sentence captures one of the most important ideas in this video, and it can serve as a reminder to pay less attention to words and more attention to actions. And it's precisely by turning your attention inward that the final part of this conversation reveals something few people have the courage to face, because it stops being about recognizing the true character of others, and begins to reveal what happens when you finally recognize your own. There comes a moment in life when observing other people's character is no longer your greatest discovery, because you realize that the most important question was never, "Who are the people around me?" but rather, "Who do I become when I'm around them?" And that shift in perspective completely transforms the way you understand human relationships. For a long time, you may have believed that developing emotional intelligence meant learning how to identify fake, manipulative, or inconsistent people. But as your perspective matures, it becomes clear that this is only the first step. The second, and far deeper, step is understanding why certain people are able to remain in your life for so long, even when their patterns had already been visible all along. Carl Jung believed that whatever remains unconscious continues to shape our choices. That means someone else's character may be revealing itself right before your eyes, but if there's an unrecognized emotional need within you, that need can speak louder than reality itself. That's why, after a painful disappointment, so many people say, "The signs were there all along." The truth is, the signs were rarely hidden. What was hidden was the inner willingness to accept them. This is one of the most liberating ideas in analytical psychology. As you begin integrating the hidden aspects of your own shadow, you stop desperately seeking approval, validation, or security from other people. And something extraordinary happens: your perception becomes far more accurate. You no longer focus only on what someone does to impress others. You begin paying attention to what they do when they have no one to impress. That difference may seem small, but it changes everything. You stop being captivated by promises and start trusting consistency. You stop valuing beautiful words alone and begin paying attention to the alignment between what people say and what they actually do. You realize that emotionally mature people don't constantly need to convince others that they're good, honest, or loyal. Those qualities reveal themselves naturally, almost quietly, because they're part of the person's character, not part of an image they're trying to maintain. At the same time, you also discover something uncomfortable about yourself. You realize that your own character isn't defined by the intentions you carry in your mind, but by the patterns you repeat when no one is watching. It's easy to stand up for your values when everything is going your way. The real challenge is living by them when no one applauds you, when no one recognizes your efforts, and when doing the right thing actually costs you something. Jung once said that, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." That statement carries an enormous responsibility. Because it reminds us that character isn't a label we're given, it's something we build every single day. Every small decision strengthens or weakens the person we're becoming. Every choice made in silence, every response to frustration, every action taken when there's no reward to be gained reveals far more about us than any identity we try to project to the world. And perhaps that's exactly why truly strong people rarely feel the need to prove their strength. People of genuine character almost never announce their character. They simply live according to principles that remain steady even when it would be easier to do otherwise. They understand that integrity doesn't depend on who's watching, it depends on who they choose to be when they're completely alone with themselves. Once this understanding truly settles in, something changes in the way you move through life. You no longer feel the need to figure people out immediately, because you understand that time always reveals what appearances try to conceal. Anxiety gives way to observation. Snap judgments give way to discernment. You learn that psychological truth rarely shouts, it quietly reveals itself through repeated behaviors, through small details that go unnoticed by those who only look at the surface. And this is the point where the search for true character stops being merely a way to avoid disappointment and becomes a path toward self-discovery. Because the more you learn to recognize human patterns, the more you realize that the same perspective also illuminates your own choices, your own impulses, and your own shadow. And perhaps that's the greatest transformation of all, discovering that it's impossible to truly understand others without first being willing to truly understand yourself. If this message resonated with you, leave the phrase, "character reveals itself in silence," in the comments. Those words capture the essence of everything we've explored today and can serve as a personal reminder to pay less attention to appearances and more attention to consistency in people's actions. After all, once you begin living with this level of awareness, you start noticing something most people never do: people are always revealing who they are, the real difference lies in who has learned how to see it. And perhaps the fact that you've made it this far already says something about the season of life you're in. Because this wasn't just a video about discovering someone's true character. It was an invitation to see people more consciously, to better understand the patterns of the human mind, and, above all, to look at yourself with greater honesty. If, at any point during this reflection, you felt as though part of your own story was being described, then this channel was made for you. Here, we don't talk about psychology on a superficial level. We explore Carl Jung's ideas, the workings of the unconscious mind, emotional patterns, human behavior, and everything that usually remains invisible yet profoundly shapes the way we live and relate to others. So if you're not already part of this community, subscribe to the channel now. That way, you won't miss the upcoming videos, where we'll continue exploring these ideas in greater depth and help you develop an even clearer understanding of both the human mind and yourself. And I'd really love to hear about your experience. Tell me in the comments, did this message resonate with you? Or share a time when you only recognized someone's true character after a long period of time. Your story may help someone else see what they still haven't been able to recognize. If this video gave you a new perspective, be sure to leave a like. That simple gesture helps YouTube recommend this content to more people who may be wrestling with the very same questions, trying to better understand the people around them and themselves. And finally, share this video with someone you believe needs to hear this message. Sometimes a single insight, at exactly the right moment, can completely change the way someone sees a relationship, a friendship, or even their entire life. Now I'd like to leave you with one final invitation. Don't stop here. The next video on your screen continues this very journey into self-discovery and depth psychology. In it, you'll uncover another fascinating aspect of human behavior that very few people ever notice, but one that can completely transform the way you understand thoughts, emotions, and relationships. Click on the next video and continue the journey. I'll see you there.